We are
So far,
live.
so good.
Okay, committee, we are
You'll do it,
live.
Counselor.
Think that most of us are here, and we've got a full agenda today. Get used to it. The days going home early on Fridays are over. No more 3:30, 4 o'clock adjournments. We're gonna do 4:54. And Julia is here. This one, we're gonna go over the supplemental spending proposals that are out there. And we'll see. Okay, and we have H&S6 to vote out. Thresholds for certificate of need. All right. The floor is yours.
Okay. Good afternoon. Okay. I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. There is a slide deck on the committee page under my name. I will go ahead and share my screen. We'll say I'm prepared, but it's not pulled up because I was deep in my spreadsheet and didn't realize it was already 1:30. So
That's okay.
Yeah.
Glad somebody gets deep into this spreadsheet.
Me too. Okay. So as the chair mentioned, I was asked to come in and do some overview and level setting in terms of spending above the foundation amount. So what I have put together in the slides here is a couple of slides about policy considerations and questions to hold in your minds while thinking about spending above foundation amount. And then I've also included summary slides for the supplemental district spending as included in H454 as passed by the House. So this is really more level setting and some examples in terms of how the mechanics would actually work. Do you know we're nonpartisan, unbiased, not providing policy recommendations?
And this committee's motto is we do not shoot the messenger.
I appreciate that. So I just mentioned this, really touching on two subjects. One is just a brief policy consideration regarding spending above a foundation amount, and then what is included in H454 as passed by the House. So in terms of spending above the foundation amount, I think sort of the first, we're talking about within a foundation formula, right? And in the creation of a foundation formula, the policy needs to determine just, first of all, are school districts allowed to spend above the foundation amount and the categorical funds they are receiving from the state. And if the answer is yes to that question, that they may spend above the foundation amount, then there are a number of policy questions, both regarding the spending above the foundation amount and also how that spending is raised. So in terms of spending above the foundation amount, we're in this world of if the decision is that school districts are permitted to spend above the foundation amount, and we will talk in a minute about what's included in H454. But if that decision is made, there are multiple policy questions, sort of thinking about the decision tree. One of the decision tree arms is the amount and the structure of that spending above. Branches. Yes. So is there a cap on how much districts can spend above the foundation amount? If so, how is the cap calculated? Is it based on student count, weighted student count, the district budget, something else? Are there certain limits or parameters for spending above the foundation amount? Limits on how those funds are spent, how they're voted on, how they're budgeted for? Is there a penalty or is there an incentive for spending above the foundation amount? If so, what is it? What does it look like? And then another broad branch of that decision tree is to raise the funds spent above. Is there an equalization mechanism? If so, what does the equalization mechanism look like? There are different ways to equalize. So, if districts are allowed to spend above the foundation amount, and if the raising of those funds are to be equalized across the state, there are different mechanisms or mechanics for doing so. So I didn't do a deep dive here into the state guarantee mechanism because I know the administration already came in and testified about it to this committee. But I've included it here just sort of as a reminder, a refresher. So the administration bill proposed a state guarantee mechanism. That's what they called it. And essentially what it did was it said districts with lower taxing capacity, so less grand list value, would have a fund of their portion they're spending over covered by the education fund, right? So they raise a certain amount on their grant list, and then the ed fund gives or supplements that delta. The mechanism would equalize taxing capacities for the lowest taxing capacity districts up to the median, right? So the administration's proposal sort of benchmarked against the median taxing capacity districts. Just the lowest up to the median had the same taxing capacity, and then the districts above the median taxing capacity had one. And we've talked about the way that essentially this would work. Is all else equal, the cost of the state guarantee would be raised from statewide property taxes, all else equal, right? Because that's a grant essentially going out to supplement those lowest taxing capacity districts. Like that state guarantee, those dollars need to come from somewhere. So H 454 is passed by the House, did not use the state guarantee mechanism. It does include a different equalization mechanism. So it still says, yes, we're going to permit school districts to raise above the foundation amount. Yes, we are going to equalize how those additional funds are raised, but we're not going to use a state guarantee mechanism. Rather, we're going to use something that this committee has spoken about called recapture. And so the rest of the slides that I put together here outline how that would actually work. So spending above the education opportunity payment in H 454 is passed by the House. You'll recall that education opportunity payment, that's the term for the foundation amount in the bill, right? That references the base amount multiplied by the district's long-term weighted average daily membership. And as passed by the House, the bill would allow school district to spend up to 10% of their education opportunity payment in supplemental district spending. I know John walked you through this. That would be subject to a local vote, so it would be approved by voters. And the bill creates a system in which every school district can raise the same amount above the foundation formula, so the same supplemental district spending at the same tax rate, regardless of their property wealth. So that's follows a similar intuition to our current construct, right? If you spend the same per pupil, you have the same tax rate, regardless of wealth. And this is done using a supplemental district spending yield. But I'll talk about
How was that tax permit? Did they get into that?
That's where we're going.
Okay.
So first, the first step is calculating the supplemental district spending yield. And so this is an example. of how it would be done. I tried to put in numbers. I used a similar construct of these slides in the House when they were contemplating it. So essentially the way that this would work is it would use this yield called the supplemental district spending yield. It would be this yield would be different than the yield that we calculate under current. It would be calculated by the Department of Taxes in the December 1 letter. So it would be published in the December 1 letter. This is the yield. So the slides are to show you how the yield would be calculated, but not because it would be a district exercise in doing this calculation. So the first step is to look at every district, their grand list per pupil. And in this example, I've completely made up 3 districts, A, B, and C. We're pretending that these are the only districts that exist and that they have really round numbers for everything. So in this example, we need to calculate their grand list per pupil, which we do by dividing their equalized grand list, so 100% of fair market value, by the district's pupil count, their long-term average daily membership. So these are my assumptions. District A and C have the same grand list of 100 million. District B has 200 million. District A and B have 100 pupils. District C is 50. So then we calculate their grand list per pupil. And then we look and we say, okay, which of these school districts has the lowest taxing capacity? So H454 defines it as the school district anticipated to have the lowest equalized grand list of all of its municipalities per long-term membership. So we just calculated the grand list per long-term membership. Now we see District B and C have a grand list per pupil of 2 million, while District A has 1 million. So there are districts with the lowest taxing capacity. And then to determine, and I think this is actually the last step. Yeah. So determine the supplemental district spending yield. Essentially, we say, how much could District A raise at a tax rate of $100 of property value? We're going to benchmark everybody against District A. So all we do is we take that district with the lowest taxing capacity, apply a tax rate of $1 for $100 of property value. Recognize that would raise $1 million in revenue. And then we have the property tax revenue per long-term median. And that would become the supplemental district spending yield for the entire state, 10,000, because that's what the lowest taxing capacity district can raise at a tax rate of $1. Hmm. I'm missing a zero. So
That's what's missing. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
I was struggling with that.
I'm missing a zero. But the intuition holds.
You got enough comments.
I have enough comments.
The math is still right.
It's true.
Yes. So that's how it'd be done without missing a zero. So the supplemental district spending yield would be 10,000 because that's what could be raised in this district.
For a penny on the tax,
Exactly. Or for $1.
for $1 on the tax.
Yeah. And so then that becomes the yield that's published in the December 1 letter. And every school district knows this is the yield, the supplemental district spending yield. And so then how does that yield work in terms of determining the tax rate? The chair's question.
So how, if part of the equation, maybe I don't understand right. If part of the equation is how much District A spends, is that part of the equation? No, we just use their grand list and their ADM count and that's it.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
So we're looking at every single district.
Okay.
And regardless of what their spending decisions are, we don't actually even need to know them in the December letter. We're just looking at the grand list.
Because they're the lowest in the state.
Yep.
Okay. All right.
So we don't. So we don't care if it's spent over or not. They're still going to set the rate.
Correct.
Right, it's not what you spend, it's your ability to raise it that gets into.
Okay. All right.
If you choose not to raise it, then that is a local. Yeah, on this, you're going to be getting X from the state. So this would be choosing to raise more than that, and it would be based on your ability, not whether or not you may not choose to spend any more.
Mhm.
And if you are the lowest tax capacity, it would be your capacity that would set the yield for everyone else.
That's correct. So you can also think about in the, I know I've been saying a lot, and I probably will continue to say a lot, that a lot of the fiscal impact depends on all outstanding policy decisions, right? So when thinking about district boundaries, if every district had the exact same grand list per pupil, then every district would be the district with the lowest taxing capacity, right? We know that that's probably not the case, at least that's not the case in current law. So this is a way of essentially benchmarking every district to whichever district has the lowest taxing capacity. So that's how the yield would be calculated. And then everyone would know what it was. So then what would happen for districts that would choose to spend above the foundation formula? Staying with the same made-up districts with the same made-up parameters. But essentially the supplemental district spending tax rate depends on the district's supplemental spending per pupil. So we have these two factors. We've got the supplemental district spending yield, which we just talked about, that's that 10,000, and then the spending per pupil. So all of the same parameters. So for this example, I said, let's just assume that every district decided to spend an additional 2,000 per pupil, per long-term student, no waits, per kid, extra 2,000.
That's insane.
Yep. So here we've got the three districts. District A and B both have 100 students, and they have 200,000 in supplemental district spending. So SDS per pupil of 2,000. District C has half of that in terms of kids, so they're spending half of that in their SDS, their supplemental district spending. All are spending 2,000 extra per kid. So to calculate their supplemental district spending tax rate, what we do is we take that supplemental district spending per pupil divided by the supplemental district spending yield, and that gives us the supplemental district spending tax rate. So we just looked at the supplemental district spending, and we know the number of students. We calculated that spending per pupil. We've already calculated the yields, and so every district would have, because every district was spending an extra 2,000 per kid, every district would have an additional tax rate of 20 cents.
Did you just pick the 2,000 per kid, or was that calculated?
I just made that up.
Okay.
That was calculated, big air quotes, on this slide, where I said, okay, District A has 200,000 in supplemental district spending divided by their long-term membership of 100, so they have 2,000 per pupil. This is a way to equalize. So for instance, we see District C has half of the kids of District A and B. So we're equalizing to calculate per pupil. We're not saying that, in this example, it's not saying, District A is saying this kid, that kid, and that kid, we're gonna give $2,000. It could be, $200,000 for whatever cost the district can do.
But I think the bill says that it can be 10% above the.
Correct.
So you didn't calculate this as 10% above something.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, it's up to 10% of the district's education opportunity payment. So to your point, that's another policy decision, right? The education opportunity payment is a reflection of the base amount multiplied by the weighted student count. So districts with a larger weighted student count will be able to spend more in supplemental district spending than districts with lower weighted counts.
But they can all spend different amounts their tax rate will be calculated on that same low yield.
Right, so,
Just, and then I believe the House has a way of distributing any excess funds that show up.
yeah, so, we're a couple slides away from the excess funds, but those excess funds would be, wait until we get there, okay? I just want to note here that, to Senator Hardy's point, totally made up the 2,000. Chose it because it was a nice round number. I like to. It could be up this, looking at this supplemental district spending, row 1. This is where we would be looking at up to 10% of the education opportunity payment as the maximum cap. Yeah, so this is how we calculate the tax rate. We take the supplemental district spending per pupil, divide it by that yield, which is how much could be raised at the lowest district at a tax rate of $1. And that gives us the supplemental district spending rate.
Okay, and the supplemental district spending rate is a whole number. It's not per pupil. They aren't doing 200,000 per pupil. They're doing 200,000 total.
Correct. Yep, 200, so District A, 200,000 total, 100 kids. That comes out to 2,000 per pupil. 2,000 per pupil divided by the 10,000 yields gives us a 20-cent rate.
So I guess it was easy.
So we see here, everybody has the same tax rate because everybody has the same spending per pupil. So now we need to think about how much are those tax rates raising, right? So to calculate the amount that that tax rate is raising, we apply it to the total equalized grant list. So H 454 has it applied to homestead and non-homestead uniformly. So by applying,
District total.
sorry,
District total.
yes, thank you. The district's total equalized grant list, so homestead plus non-homestead, every property within the district. So by applying that 20-cent tax rate, we then see how much is raised in each district, right? Because it's for every $100 property value. So what we see, so what we see here, right? District A is raising 200,000 from the 20-cent tax rate. District B is raising 400,000. District C is raising 200,000. So then we need to, so the last step is the recapture mechanism, right? So we know that each district decided to spend an additional 2,000 per pupil. We know that meant each district has the same tax rate. Because of the equalization, some districts raised more than their supplemental district spending that they voted. So District A, this was our district with the lowest taxing capacity. So we were benchmarking against District A. So that means that they raised exactly their supplemental district spending. So they raised that in the 20-cent tax rate. It goes up to the state, and then the state sends it back to the district as their supplemental district spending. District B raised 400,000 from their 20-cent tax rate. So they send the 400,000 up to the state. That was raised, and the state says, okay, you voted 200,000 in your supplemental district spending. That's what your tax rate corresponded with. Here is your 200,000 in supplemental district spending. There's still 200,000 left in the state that's recaptured. District C, same idea. They raised 200,000 from their 20-cent tax rate. We know they voted 100,000. So 100,000 is returned to the district and 100,000 is held by the state, recaptured. I don't have a slide about this, but these recaptured revenues go into that supplemental district spending reserve that John walked through last week. They are held there to ensure that any of the assumptions that went into the calculation of the yield were accurate, you know, if there was any sort of mathematical error or data limitation. That's what the supplemental district spending reserve is. When we know that things are squared away, then the dollars in supplemental district spending reserve then waterfall into the school construction special fund. So in this instance, this 300 would be held in the supplemental district spending reserve until the close of the fiscal year. And then assuming all of the calculations were right, then that 300,000 would waterfall into the special fund.
So this is, in essence, charging the more property wealthy towns to fund school construction. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah,
Districts, not towns, but
Yeah.
yes,
they're the bigger brands.
okay, one way to do it,
Say that one more time? If they choose to spend above.
if they choose to spend funds. And they are property wealthy. And they raise more,
Well,
okay.
not necessarily well, but in any town that's above the lowest town. District above the lowest district,
What, above the median, right?
This is all benchmarked to the lowest.
the lowest.
Okay, all benchmark to the lowest, all right. This will give us something to talk about.
That's everything I have prepared.
All right,
Okay.
so we can estimate how much money might go in there, because at this point, the foundation is paid to be at current cost, right?
That's correct. We also don't know what the district configurations are. We also don't know what the future school districts, what they would choose to do in supplemental district spending. We don't know how voters would respond. And we're talking about right now, the timeline in H 454 is passed by the House, has a earliest effective date of July 1, 2029. So those are the considered one piece that I will add in terms of framing the conversation. This gets back to the manner of equalization, right? So I think that there's sort of two pieces of the policy conversation, or two big buckets. One is this the equalization mechanism that the committee is interested in moving forward with in terms of equalizing by benchmarking against the lowest taxing capacity district? Then there's also the question of what to do with recaptured funds, right? Should they be used for funding school construction as is currently included in the bill, or should they be used for another purpose? They're tangential questions and also distinct.
So thank you, Madam Chair. I mean, I think the other question is, do we even want to have supplemental spending?
That was the first decision.
Yeah, because I know that some of my colleagues are worried that the foundation formula will be at the whim of future legislatures, and I get that. But I don't see how doing this isn't gonna create inequities, even if we do have equalizing measures in place. It just seems as though wealthier districts are gonna be able to spend more freely and put us right back to where we used to be. I'm not saying that to you, Julia, I'm saying that to the committee, but it's a policy decision, obviously.
It is a policy, and it's harder because I think we're still tend to think of districts as towns, and that these are going to be larger districts with more schools. So there may be less inequity. Yeah, so it'll be a property wealthy district. But within that district, there's likely to be some fairly poor towns and some fairly wealthy towns. And I think that's one of the concerns is because I think the governor's plan has a lot of decisions being made by the district school board with the advice of more localized advisory committees, I think they would, we need a little more muscly term, but that's the other mechanism that's thing that's playing is what, depending on the district, what's the spread between the towns in that district? Because if there's two wealthier towns or three, and they vote, then that's that poorer town is going to pay the same thing, so it'll be, yeah, equalized.
Okay.
Senator Harney.
Yeah, just remember though, in the districts, they will have to have voting boards that have to be proportional and
Yes.
equitable voting boards based on, you know, constitutional proportionality. So that will be somewhat, but I do hear you. There are certainly more population centers that could drive some of the conversation, but
That will. There's a wide variety of sizes over there. The wider, the larger the districts. And that's one advantage, the more dispersed. You know, the greater mix of wealth you will probably have, and we've had that, the smaller districts. Within a larger district, you'll have smaller wards. Within a smaller district, you will have rich and poor districts. So which one gives you the greatest equity?
I'm sure you wanted this afternoon to go, but would this be a good time for me to offer greater clarity as to another approach, a mixed approach on this?
Yeah, I had actually hoped to have you on the agenda, but the email thread I saw said it wasn't ready for prime time.
So I don't have language, but what I do have is a spreadsheet, which I could walk through building off of what Julia just said. I did see Senator Gulick's hand went up, but before I share the screen, would this be okay, Madam Chair, for me just to articulate and?
If you can, yeah,
Can I ask one question?
Yeah,
before I
go
start?
for it.
This proposal that you discussed, Julia, when you talk about the grand list, you're talking about the entire grand list of the district, not as homestead or,
correct.
okay, that's my
Yeah,
question. That's
everything.
clarifying. Okay,
The entire grant list that's subject to property tax.
that's right, yeah, okay.
and at the present time, they're all subject to the same property tax.
Yeah.
Which that change will vary by district. Okay.
I want to just set this spreadsheet up a little bit more. And then what I was trying to do in the background was really overlaying Julia's example with the three districts that might have raised above. So let me just orient the audience to this. This is based off of the VBSA map that came out earlier in the session, just as an academic exercise, not the actual district that would materialize. And Julia,
That's the third one from the left on the board. Yes.
so these represent those maps. And what you have here is data from Julia. Thank you again for working with me over spring break or town meeting week. We have the total equalized grand list value for each of those districts, as well as the long-term ADMs for each of those districts. So this is right here what would materialize and how I understand what the House has done is this recapture column. So this is sorted where Franklin Grand Isle, based on that VBSA, would have, as I understand it, the lowest LDA grand list to ADM ratio. Does that make sense? So I've sorted this that if we use the House's framework on these districts, Franklin Grand Isle would be the bench for the yield. Does that make sense? Ignore this one right here. So that's the yield in this case would really be 1 million divided, moving the decimal place 2 places. So it would be 1035.20. And I think I have that as another one. So to follow on what Julia just represented, Franklin Grand Isle would have the lowest grand list to pupil ratio. Now, I understand from the House, and this is where I'm still getting clarity, is that they have a proportional amount, and I think that bore out with what Julia presented, where the amount to recapture would be relative to how much their ratio compares to that yield base. So that's what I have in this recapture column. So for example, if these districts were to hold, and I'm not saying they're going to, Wyndham would have the highest grand list to pupil ratio, and they would end up, to your point, Madam Chair, they would have the highest amount contributing to that potential fund of, for every dollar they raise, they pretty much have to raise 95 cents to go, my understanding, and I could be wrong on this, but they'd have to raise about another 95 cents if they chose to go above that amount to the not slush fund, the buffer fund that then feeds into the bond fund. So I'm sure John has a better name for that. So what I do support this more than what the administration brought forward with the state guarantee, because I do like that this captures money, and in a way it incentivizes to have people sort of try to think before they want to raise above the amount we allocate to them. But one notion that percolated, which is really a combination between what the administration brought forward and what the House came up with, which would instead be setting the unit. I'm going to switch spreadsheets, not to disorient you all. I'm just going to switch to this spreadsheet. I'm sorry. So this is my running of Julia's numbers. The House yield would be this 10,353 based on Franklin ratio. I'm calling it, for lack of a better term, the Tom Chittenden yield, okay, the TC yield. Don't put any names on it, all right? So the TC. Well, I didn't know what else to call it.
Yeah. I love it.
All right, the TC yield would be based effectively on the total grand list for the state relative to the total ADM for the kids, of how many kids we have in the states. The yield would be based on the total grand list. There was one school district, how much all the property's worth in Vermont, relative to how many kids are in Vermont, the LTADM. So my yield would actually be right smack dab in the middle, where I like to be. All right, so it's 14,670, which is what that would then be used for, is to calculate both a guarantee and a recapture rate. So I'm going to just scroll over to here. So if we were to set that as the yield, we wouldn't start by setting the base as the lowest in this ratio town, but instead we would compare each school district's grand list to pupil ratio, and should they have a lower ratio to the statewide yield amount, they would get the state guarantee, effectively making their dollars cheaper. And if they have a grand list higher, a grand list to pupil ratio more than what the state ratio is, they would actually do the recapture rate proportional to how their ratio compares to the yield value, which is consistent with what the House has done. And so what I ran the numbers here is, if just so that we could materialize this, that if this Kingdom South district, which would fall in the state guarantee realm, so they would have the cheaper dollars. If they were to choose to raise $2,000 per pupil, per Julia's example, and let's say Central Vermont, and I really don't know which one that is, they wanted to raise $2,000, and then Wyndham wanted to raise $2,000 per pupil.
Central and Western or Eastern Chittenden seem to be the two that, on all the things Julia did, were pretty close to each other, so they are pretty much the middle. And Wyndham is the highest.
So we would compare those amounts to the comparable yield and then relatively adjust it to their proportional effect. Wait, I really want to make this more complicated for Senator Brock. So I just thought that what the House sent over was too simple, and I wanted to just make this much more involved. That's an attempt at humor. But you'll notice here that the guarantee and recap column basically shows that this district wanting to raise $2,000 more per pupil would get an effective rate of 10 cents, getting the difference proportional to the 29% ratio, which means we'd have to cover about a $3 million shortfall. And I think my numbers are a little off somewhere in here, and I need to dig into it a little bit deeper. But I think proportionally, this district, which has an 8% comparable higher amount, they would end up feeding that. What's the term, John? What do we call that fund?
Right now,
Going into the
construction
spending reserve.
Supplemental spending reserve before it goes into the school construction fund. This district, if they chose to raise that, they would have to get an effective increased property tax rate of 15 cents for the whole district. And they would feed that fund about $2 million. And this Wyndham district would actually feed it $5 million.
Okay,
That's my idea. I welcome criticisms and thoughts. I just thought it would come at it from the middle rather than from the bottom or from the top.
okay, I'm not sure I completely understand all your numbers. But I think you've explained to me what would happen if just Kingdom South or Kingdom South and Grand Isle decided to raise supplemental money and
Yeah.
where, and if none of the more property wealthy did, where would the money come from? So we might have to capitalize it for the first year because eventually that money would come from the supplemental spending, formerly known as slush fund.
That's how I envision it, is basically you cover the guarantee with potentially, we just don't know how the school districts would behave with what they would raise in excess from the recapture.
So, if you, I would like to see what this looks like only using the homestead grant list. And yes, I mean, this could potentially run a deficit for any given year. However, I'm gonna say that it probably won't, because I think your higher property wealth districts will be more high. I know that for sure. So.
There's some history behind that.
But yeah, I'd like to see what it looks like who's using the homestead grant list. I think there's a lot less variability between the homestead grant list and the entire grant list.
I'm thinking you might be right. There's a difference in guys, but they
Yeah.
tend to. But there are clusters.
Yeah, it all gets moderated, the bigger the
Industry.
district, but.
Why would you wanna just do the homestead? Cause they're not the only one, they're taxed. Wouldn't you
Right,
wanna be
well, my
looking at
thought
the
is
full
you
grant
would, you would use the full, non-homestead to fund the foundation. That's where you get that money.
Okay,
Yeah.
which is similar to what we do now. If the non-homesteads don't vote. So they are adjusted by the local spending
They're just by the
by
statewide.
the statewide rate.
Wait, so you think we should just fund the foundation just using the non-homestead?
No, I just think that the non-homestead should only be used for the foundation. You would also use a statewide homestead rate and the consumption taxes and everything else, but.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good, Mandos.
Love meeting in the middle. The thing that just pops into my mind seeing this for the first, maybe second time, is that offhand, it makes me feel that lower property wealthy districts are supplementing higher property districts by using the TC yield. You are using the whole entire statewide grand list, therefore having those negatives going from 95% in the recapture for Wyndham down to 38, you're essentially subsidizing them. So the higher value districts are getting subsidized by the lower districts.
So the intent is the opposite, but maybe I didn't explain that well. So my intention is that, let me go back to this here at the end. So if we were to play this out in this scenario, this lower wealth district would actually get a discount. They would be subsidized by the districts with more property wealth.
So say all the ones in the green don't spend $1 over.
Yeah.
They are subsidizing all the ones above that list.
But they're not subsidizing them
Because their property tax rate will go up overall, because they're helping fund.
Yeah.
That ratio,
No,
that yield,
if Franklin Grand Isle doesn't spend a penny of supplemental, they're not.
but their base tax rate is higher. Because you are supplementing.
But they're not supplementing it. They don't spend anything. They won't have any, there's no numerator.
Have you had enough time to look at this, or John, to figure it out?
I haven't had enough time to look at this. I guess I will say one piece of, I think that what the committee discussion is kind of moving around to Senator Matos. His point is, one of the big questions is what happens if the supplemental district spending above the median district does not align with the supplemental district spending below the median district, right?
Yeah.
Because if it's not a wash and the supplemental district spending below the median district is greater than what is being recaptured in the higher.
Yeah.
property value districts, then it needs to be made up somewhere.
Right.
Which is through property taxes.
Okay, John,
Yeah, and just to respond to the question about if you're subsidizing the higher tier, the thing that I think is most responsive to that is where's the state guarantee coming from, right? So if, and I think this is Senator Chinden's proposal, if what funds the state guarantee is those above the median, then I think the thinking is that those above the median are entirely covering the cost of what they voted locally. And then they're raising extra funds that could be used to reduce the cost for those below. But Julia's point is right, which is that if you didn't have anyone above, you now have a shortfall, and that does result in where you got to find that money somewhere. And presumably, if you do something like the administration's proposal, the place that came was in that statewide issue. She probably said, but you,
Yeah.
she's everybody.
In my sketch, this money, that positive 1.9 million and positive 5.3, that's the amount that those wealthier districts would feed into that fund.
So how do they get it cheaper then? Where is it coming from? Because if,
They're getting.
because it's coming from
They're
the state
getting-
guarantee and the recapture.
They're not getting it cheaper. So if you have a higher, if you're below yellow through red, your money's more expensive. And when you raise money, you're eating into.
Right, I get that, but if you click over to the other side, as in
They're
454,
They're paying $1.34 to raise a dollar.
you're paying that $1.95 for that dollar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, how are you getting it cheaper for $1.38?
What I see this doing is rather than taking more from all of those districts down at the bottom, this is trying to, in the middle,
It's,
give a discount to people with a lower property wealth and take money from those with higher property wealth. This will, in my thinking, will result in less money going to that supplemental fund, and it runs a greater risk of running a deficit if only the state guarantee school districts raise above the amount. If the wealthier districts don't, then we will have to come up with that shortfall, more so than the House.
with that one, and that you also not funding the school construction.
I do not portend to have all the right
Yeah.
answers, and I'm not saying this is definitely the right answer.
This
seems
this is just me.
There's enough
First time
game
thinking about it.
here, and
I mean, this makes sense to me.
it's,
Yeah.
it makes as much sense
But-
as any, it's
I
the
don't,
risk. I think it's probably valid, and we can look at history that wealthier towns are more likely to spend above the foundation than poorer towns, unless we see a major change in behavior, which we haven't.
So I think to that, I think, poorer towns are less, property wealthy towns are less likely to have voters approve their spending above it, so they tried and they failed.
Yeah.
Because the voters said, no, that's happened in my district multiple times. But I don't understand what policy problem you're trying to solve with this, except for to come up with a compromise that isn't necessary.
so what I say to the point you just raised, if the districts, Franklin Grand Isle, Kingdom South, Rutland, and Kingdom North, I don't know, but if they are districts that often don't support higher levels of spending, this policy approach would make their dollars less expensive because the wealth and the grand list to pupil ratio is lower. So I think that someone addresses that first point. The second half of this, I was just imagining if I was Windsor or Wyndham, and if I wanted to raise money, my grand list is going to feed that supplemental district spending fund at a much higher rate than the lowest one, Franklin County. So I saw the approach from hitting it from the middle, which is sort of where the administration started. They started with the median amount and then gave the state guarantee for those that spent underneath this. This still, in a way, does that. It doesn't use the median, it uses the mean, but this couples it basically takes the administration approach and adds the recapture rate to raise additional revenues off of the richer districts. I'm trying to find equitable financing for our education system. So that's the policy I'm trying to.
And
I think that.
I'm not sure that this does it.
Either
But I mean, and I have to think about it a little bit more. You did show it to me a couple weeks ago and I had forgotten about it, but it does seem to me that I agree with Senator Mathos. I'm still not seeing how the the lower property value districts aren't just subsidizing the higher property value districts. And on top of that, one of the whole points of what we're attempting to do here is to simplify our system. That's definitely one of the goals. Certainly one of Senator Brock's goals. And this doesn't do it. Like, it's not intuitive to me, so it's not going to be intuitive to most people, I don't think. I love the fact that, you know, in the December 1st letter, there's a yield. You know, then everybody knows what the yield is. You calculate that, you can, you know, figure it all out. And that we have extra money to put toward a high need, which is school construction.
Maybe if I could frame this discussion and that response with something I think could be productive next, if the chair would allow, is I'd love to see how with these, just for lack of a better example of districts, how the state's approach for the recapture rate might translate with these districts. I love Julia's examples with the 3 districts, but it might be useful to sort of play this out with how you understand the state.
I think it might be helpful if we could get some kind of a side by side. Am I reading this correctly? That in order to raise, all things being equal, $1 per student, Franklin Grand Isle would only need to raise 71 cents, and the other towns would raise the difference
With the TC approach.
with, so I guess I'm still doing a little apples to oranges here. And it would be helpful if we were all talking about the same terms, and maybe we could work with,
I'm
to see if
hesitant.
Julia can do it.
I never want to use AFO or Ledge Council's time without them being worthy.
I mean, the yield, the pushback I can see from some of the more property wealthy towns is, why are we paying for school construction somewhere else? Because we're paying a higher amount on our yield and it's going in. And depending on how much that is, but if I built a new school, if I'm Burlington and I build a new school, and now I'm one of the more property wealthy towns, so our districts, I'm now going to help pay for a school in the kingdom. That may be more complicated than, but if we can't find any way to do school construction.
Well, I
Either
also
way.
think that a lot of this depends on what the districts end up being.
Yes.
And we don't know what those districts are gonna be. And so modeling everything out based on a guess, I think is, and then making those decisions based on a guess is really problematic, I think. We really need to be thinking about what makes sense from a, you know, mathematical perspective, a policy perspective, a simplicity perspective. And then after we know the districts, we can tweak it. But I think that making assumptions about what the districts are going to be in and changing it based on that is not a good idea right
But
now.
I think we're kind of working in the median area. I think it's not going to be the first 2 maps. They're very small. It's not going to be the governor's map, which isn't even up there. Is that bottom map the one that the Senate education is thinking about?
The small one on the bottom?
Yes.
Yeah, I could just respond.
Yeah,
maybe.
I mean, it's going to be somewhere between that, school boards. They're going to, I don't think we're gonna end up with something as large as the governor or as small as we have now. So I think just for assumption purposes, working off of any one of those
That's what I
gives us a ballpark.
try to establish is I'm not endorsing these districts, but I see modeling. It's not mathematical guesses, just to inform our conversation. That's my attempt with
I
this.
mean, all of this is based on assumptions. Everything until we get to a lot of it is assumptions about human behavior, which is highly risky. And I think that's one way to do it. We'll see if we can't get it. The closer we can get it to doing apples to apples, I think the better, but you have to go.
I kind of add,
So we're gonna move on. No more numbers, all right.
I was gonna go one step further than Senator Hardy, which was just maybe this conversation is a little premature and that we haven't actually truly fleshed out the whole philosophical discussion about whether or not we want supplemental spending. We haven't heard from John about the Brigham
That's what we're doing
implications.
next.
So I just, instead of going too deep into this, maybe we need to put the cart before the horse or the horse.
This is, we've got a House proposal. I don't know what Senate Ed is going to do. Senator Chittenden's given us a somewhat larger area proposal. We have a couple of proposals. I keep assuming we're going to something closer to the school boards than the governors or the present structure, just for modeling purposes. But we do have a lot, and no, the first decision we're going to make, we've walked through what the House did. But the chair of the House committee said she had concerns that the minute you went above base, you left it open to inequity. And we've been dealing with inequity with schools voting different amounts, significantly different amounts. We've done it on how much a penny raises in every town, but that does not mean that every town has the same capacity to just raise a penny just on the wealth of the residents, not necessarily the wealth, the grand list.
Well, can I add one?
Yeah.
Just to Senator Chinden's point that, you know, the dollar in the poorer districts would be worth more. But that doesn't translate to voter behavior. Like that doesn't mean that voters are gonna vote for the supplement. And that's where, again, like that's where we get into the inequity, and that's right. Because I mean, my district votes school
Just
budgets.
regarding the carbon course, this is a proposal that came from the House, and this is like a building on the
Right.
discussion, so I think really entirely true.
I appreciate it. Yeah, it's totally true. And I
We
appreciate you bringing it up.
may decide that we aren't going to move above base. That leaves the responsibility on us to make sure we have an adequate base. And we have to determine how we're going to raise that base. There will be some schools that are not happy with the base, and there will probably be some schools that are overjoyed with the base, depending on what they're spending now, and depending on how much we tax what to raise it. Our job is to find something that's equitable, and I'm gonna have John come up and walk us through Brigham.
Very cool.
I think one question that comes to my mind is, has anybody else in any other state had the same problem that we have, and have they solved it in a way that we haven't thought of?
I think what we
Every state
heard
has the
is
same discussion.
48 other states do
Have foundation
have
for
a foundation formula, but then there are, and that's why I like Senator Beck's tie, because it looked like
Is
the
it still got
model.
salad dressing?
Yeah, no, not the blue one. The multi-striped one, because we had the
Oh.
presentation from the, well, it was a national organization, National Association of
The
Commission of Education.
Commission on
Education
Education.
Commission on
Education.
And they went through, and there was different colored stripes, remember, and every state had a different
Yeah.
mixture of stripes, and it came out like
I'm
Senator
glad my
Beck.
tie is
Always reminds
Well,
me
one
of that.
part I like about what we've heard is that Franklin County, if it needs to build a school, will just simply send the bill to William County.
We haven't gotten a response from Wyndham County on that.
We're gonna make it more complicated than that.
You know, as former head of Ways and Means, but I know she's not the first one, says the minute you try and make something fair, it gets complicated.
It's true.
Well, that's one of the major problems we have right now, trying to get out to the public explaining how this system works.
Yes.
And I haven't heard a whole lot yet that has made this any easier to explain.
No, when you're dealing with how you equitably raise and distribute money, other than a flat tax, which has other implications. Yeah, you don't. Yeah.
I don't know everything about what every state's done, that most of them have been sued. But I think the general theme is, what do they do to counter these lawsuits? They increase the foundation amount from the state.
Yeah.
We are talking about a system here where the state will buy probably 99% of all education spending. So I think we're on pretty solid ground.
Yeah, the lawsuits in other states, the last one I heard was Wyoming, are whether or not we have picked the right inflator, and when the next downturn comes, what do? Do we make the cuts to the education? In the past, we have not. We have protected education. But if things crash and burn, what do? And that will be dealt with by all the lucky people who are here today. May it not be us, because the last time there was an economic downturn, it was me. All around. So, Joan, we're going to change. We're getting off numbers and fair, and it comes with the law says we have to do.
That sounds good. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel, small piece to respond to the discussion you guys were just having. Part of why it is sometimes less meaningful in this context to look to other states than in other arenas is that there's no federal constitutional right to education. So each state is solving a state-specific problem under their own state constitution. And that's what we're going to talk about now.
There is no federal right to an education. Interesting.
There was a case in the 70s, Rodriguez. Not going to talk about that today, but
Where's the waterfall? Like the visiting.
it's beautiful, right? I should just do that for each slide and not even have.
It's soothing.
Next time. Is that it?
I was hoping that Sparta Brook falls out behind the car dealership and bury my video.
I am sharing this through what is posted on the tab, which means I'll be scrolling. If that's going to be frustrating, I can just pull up the PowerPoint and do it in presentation mode, but if you guys are cool. So, we're talking about Brigham. Going to start off with some historical background. So what problems were happening in Vermont at the time that Brigham came about, which was in 1987. So back in 1987, we had Act 84, which created the Vermont Foundation Plan. It's not like this foundation formula. It was another kind of foundation plan. And this funded public education through a combination of local property taxes, so unlike the current system, and state aid. And the way that it did this was by setting two figures. So the state would decide on this foundation tax rate, and some of this will really be familiar. I think back in early January, we had a really quick joint hearing, but it was not as fulsome as this presentation. So Vermont would set two figures, this foundation tax rate, and this was just whatever the state would say is a reasonable rate to charge to raise at least a minimum quality education program. But that would, of course, be applied across quite wildly different school districts in terms of the wealth they had available. So the second figure they would set is the foundation cost, which would be the amount needed per student, essentially, that's for that minimum quality program. So, of course, what this meant is that if you were in a property poor district, when you applied that foundation tax rate, you may not raise the foundation cost. There might be a gap between what you raise and what that foundation cost is. Similarly, if you're a quite wealthy school district and you apply that foundation tax rate, you might raise funds that are greater than the foundation cost. So you have more on hand. And what would happen for those below the foundation cost is state aid would be calculated to make up the difference between the foundation cost and the amount that they could raise at the foundation tax rate. But note that it was just what could be raised. So if your school district didn't want to raise even the foundation tax rate, you were only getting a state aid that took you from that theoretical, what you would raise at the foundation tax rate up to the foundation costs. So it is possible that under this program, you wouldn't have even met the foundation cost. And in any event, wealthier school districts would have the possibility of raising additional funds beyond the foundation
And the
cost.
foundation was the frame, what it costs to do a minimum quality
Exactly.
education.
Exactly. We're going to talk about that too. You said that we had made it past numbers, but we haven't. I like numbers too. So, just a, sorry, this is covering up some of the.
Yeah.
There we go. So just to demonstrate what I was talking about, imagine that your foundation rate, so the reasonable rate that the state is saying they could charge to raise that minimum quality program would be 1%. And you have a foundation cost per student of 5,000. These are entirely arbitrary numbers, as is pretty obvious. And let's say your school districts want to raise 10K. So they want to get 5,000 more than that foundation cost per pupil. Imagine a school district that can afford to put forward 400K in grand list value per pupil versus one that can put together or put forward 1 million in grand list value per pupil. In your 400K, in your poorer school district, when they apply that foundation rate of 1%, they're just going to raise 4,000K per pupil, right? That's what you get from your 1%. And so the foundation cost is 5,000. The state aid kicks in that 1,000 to take them from 4,000 to 5,000. And that's what they get is they end up with $5,000 per pupil at a 1% rate. And they get some state aid in there. But note for the wealthier school district, this $1 million in grand list, if they apply a 1% rate, they get 10K per pupil. So they're getting their goal, the 10,000 figure, just at that 1% rate. If your poorer district wanted to raise that same amount, you can see on the right side in the yellow, they would have to apply an additional 1.25% tax to get them to that figure. So to raise the same funds, your poorer district had to apply a total property tax rate of 2.25% as against the 1% rate in your wealthier district. So this is just a high level example of the way that this works pre-Brigham. So what happened in Brigham? The plaintiffs alleged 3 separate pieces here. So one related to students, one related to property owners, and one related to the school districts themselves. So for the students, they said, the education finance system violated the Vermont Constitution by depriving students in these property poor school districts of their right to the same educational opportunities as students in wealthier school districts. It compelled property owners in those property poor school districts to contribute an unjust proportion of tax dollars. I will just note that on this particular claim, this wasn't really factually developed in the earlier stages of litigation, so the court didn't address this particular piece. And then for your school districts, deprive the what you can put together from the two above, deprive those property poor school districts of the ability to raise sufficient money to provide educational opportunities equal to those in wealthier school districts, which meant they were compelled to impose disproportionately high tax rates if they wanted to do so. So those were the allegations. Let's start with how the court saw the picture, like what facts were they thinking about in this context? And I should just kind of high level talk about what I hope this presentation achieves. There's always lots of speculation as to what Brigham will mean, how we can analyze in a particular context. What I try to do in this presentation is not talk about what a hypothetical court might take it to mean, but just to talk about what it literally says, because this is the basis on which you could make those determinations. So just starting with their factual discussion, the Supreme Court said, even if we're to assume that that plan is working adequately to accomplish its purpose, we look at the constitutionality of the system in light of the limited nature of its purpose. And this gets to the comments you were making about minimum quality. The object of the plan is not quality of educational opportunity generally, or even equality of local capacity to facilitate opportunity. It's only to equalize capacity to produce that minimally adequate education, assuming the voters can sustain the state selected tax rate. So that goes back as well to the point I was making that the state aid is determined based on what they could raise at the foundation rate, but a school district might not do that. So that's what that last clause, assuming the voters can sustain the state selected tax rate is. So the purpose of the plan was just to equalize capacity to produce that minimally adequate education. And it also presumed that folks would actually put forward that rate or support that particular foundation rate. Additionally, made some observations about how wealth links with expenditure and how expenditure links with educational opportunity. So wealthier school districts were relatively more able than poorer districts to raise the funds necessary to support an educational program that was more than minimally adequate. So recall that hypothetical about the 10K figure, getting above your minimally adequate. That wealthier school district had an easier time, a lower tax burden to raise those same funds. The undisputed evidence amply supports plaintiffs' claims that wide disparities in student expenditures exist among Vermont school districts, and that these disparities correlate generally with taxable property wealth within the district. So there's a clear link between expenditure and wealth. And lastly, while the record didn't develop whether those funding disparities resulted in unequal educational opportunities, it didn't need to, because the state had already conceded this. The state had conceded that the funding scheme denies children residing in comparatively property-poor school districts the same educational opportunities that are available to students residing in wealthier districts. So putting these pieces together, there's a clear link between wealth and expenditure, and the state has conceded that different spending creates different educational opportunities, which would necessarily correlate with those wealthier districts with the average back. Lastly, the court concluded that while equal dollar resources do not necessarily translate equally in effect, there's no reasonable doubt that substantial funding differences significantly affect opportunities to learn. Money is clearly not the only variable affecting educational opportunity, but it is one that government can effectively equalize. So in part, talking about the practicality of getting at this particular measure. So money isn't educational opportunity, and there have been later cases in this line that talk about how money is not opportunity, but it's one of the things that that the government can equalize to get at educational opportunity. I think you guys know the answer to this question. But do these disparities in educational opportunities violate Vermont law? In Vermont, the right to education is so integral to our constitutional form of government and its guarantees of rights that any statutory framework that infringes upon it bears a commensurate heavy burden of justification. We conclude that the current system, which conceivably denies equal educational opportunities, is constitutionally deficient. But what did they hang that determination on? So two particular clauses we're going to talk about in the Vermont Constitution. First, the education clause, and then we'll come to the benefits clause, which is a kind of equal protection like clause. But first, the right to education in Vermont. What you'll see if you look to Chapter 2, Section 68, is that the Constitution provides that a competent number of schools ought to be maintained in each town unless the General Assembly permits other provisions for the convenient instruction of youth. And the court goes on to hang a lot on the text and structure of the Constitution and the history itself to draw why this right is so important. So related to structure, it says that only one governmental service, public education, has ever been accorded constitutional status in Vermont. So education is special. It's recognized in the Constitution. This is something that the state is on the hook for. And even further than that, the history of Vermont supports. So apart from its prominence, the importance of education to self-government and the state's duty to ensure its proper dissemination have been enduring things in the political history of Vermont. And there's all kinds of historical pieces of the decision. I didn't include obviously all of them here, but if you're interested in that sort of thing, you'll see a lot of talk about how democracy, this particular form of government, depended on having a right to education. So importantly for you guys, where does the constitutional responsibility for education lie? The state had argued in this case that the primary constitutional responsibility rests with the towns, and that the state just had the responsibility to ameliorate inequities if they became too extreme. So basically they were saying, yes, we've delegated these things to the towns, but the towns need to deal with this, and we come in if things go too far off the rails, basically. The court explicitly rejected that argument and declared that the state may delegate to local towns and cities the authority to finance and administer the schools within their boundaries, but it cannot abdicate the basic responsibility for education by passing it on to local governments, which are themselves creations of the state. So no matter what, the state remains on the hook for the constitutional responsibility for education. This will either be happy or upsetting news that you guys already know, but does the Constitution mandate a particular method of funding? It doesn't. The court noted that although the state has a constitutional obligation to provide public education, it's silent regarding the way in which it must be funded. And specifically noted that while the legislature has implemented the education clause through local property taxes, this method or any other method of financing public education is constitutionally mandated. It's a constitutional obligation of the state. Funding of education through locally imposed property taxes is not. Our constitution nowhere states that the revenue for education must be raised locally, the source of revenue must be property taxes, or that such revenues must be distributed unequally in conformity with local wealth. That last clause in particular is what a lot of the decision is getting at. So that's your education clause. But the other big hook here, and this is what gives us our substantial equality of educational opportunity, is the common benefits clause. And as I mentioned before, this is kind of like a equal protection type clause. And I can read that, the constitutional language is set out here. But I think the important thing is in the next bullet, which is just the court saying we don't even need to consider the level of scrutiny that you need to undertake to analyze this kind of inequity. We're simply unable to fathom a legitimate governmental purpose to justify the gross inequities in educational opportunities evident from the record. The distribution of a resource as precious as educational opportunity may not have as its determining force the mere fortuity of a child's birth. So where a kid is born cannot be what determines the kind of educational opportunity the kid receives. That said, you can imagine what counts as equality, and if we're using the modifier substantial, what falls within that range. And so I want to point to two particular pieces here that get at the kind of variation in spending that might be permissible. So first, and I think this is particularly relevant in a lot of the discussions that have happened about folks saying that the base solves the equation, right? The foundation amount solves the equation. In Britain, the court explicitly rejected the argument that achievement of a minimally adequate education is sufficient to satisfy the Vermont Constitution. We find no authority for the proposition that discrimination in the distribution of a constitutionally mandated right, such as education, may be excused merely because a minimal level of opportunity is provided to all. So equality is going to look at the whole picture. It's not just going to look at a minimal level. But the court did observe that absolute equality in funding is neither a necessary nor a practical requirement to satisfy the constitutional command. Equal opportunity doesn't require, or does not necessarily require, precisely equal per capita expenditures. So think about things like weighting, reflecting differences among students. You don't have to have necessarily precisely equal per capita expenditures. But even further, nor does it necessarily prohibit cities and towns from spending more on education if they choose. So folks can spend differently within some range. But importantly, it doesn't allow a system in which educational opportunity is necessarily a function of district wealth. And this is why we talk so much about equalizing rates. Brigham's holding. So this is the law on this front. The current system, this is at the start of the case, the current system for funding public education in Vermont, with a substantial dependence on local property taxes and resultant wide disparities in revenues, deprives children of an equal educational opportunity, violations of the Constitution. And children, and this is kind of the key line that folks will remember, children who live in property poor districts, children who live in property rich districts should be afforded a substantially equal opportunity to have access to similar educational revenues. To fulfill its constitutional obligation, the state must ensure substantial equality of educational opportunity throughout Vermont. The last thing that I have here is just, what kind of guidance can we take away from this? We try to stick, we try to have kind of the most minimal. We don't want to extend beyond interpretations that are on the face of the text to the extent that we can. What can we pretty safely take away from this case? The most obvious point, Vermont students are constitutionally entitled to equal educational opportunities, and we commonly talk about substantially equal educational opportunities. The state has the constitutional responsibility, so state is on the hook. You cannot delegate this to local, you can't just delegate to the local school districts to address this problem. Discrimination cannot be excused merely because a minimal level of opportunity is provided to all. Money is one variable affecting opportunity. The state has the ability to equalize, but of course, you could have all kinds of other conversations about educational opportunity. The Constitution doesn't require absolute equality of funding, so I would think about that again in the context of 3 and 5 kind of together, talking about the amount of variation that's permissible. Doesn't mandate any system of education funding, and the especially fun piece for you guys. The specific means of discharging the state's constitutional duty to ensure substantially equal opportunities properly led to your discretion.
Okay.
I'm going to end with some more water balls. So
So that begs
I love blur.
The question, I guess, talking about 10% more. If, depending on the level of the base funding, what percent more triggers? You know, is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 1?
We don't know. Is
We
the-
don't
and-
know.
And to go back to a conversation you were having while Julie was still here before I got in the chair. You were talking about the difficulties of even setting up the supplemental district spending in the absence of knowledge about the boundaries of the school districts. I mean, you just, I realize that y'all are trying to roll something out to have a picture of what the thing will be, but you're gonna, whatever you do will have to be revised once you have the
Yeah.
school district boundaries set out.
But
Because imagine, like, just to draw that out, imagine this imagine a 5 district proposal where you have relatively equal grant lists per people for each school district. Okay? Like, in that case, you're not gonna have wild variation among them,
Right.
so folks are gonna be raising at relatively equal rates anyway, even if you
Yeah.
engage in equalization. Whereas if you have the current system, you could have wildly different.
do,
So that, like, raising 95 cents on the dollar for every dollar you want to raise, you can have outcomes like that.
so if we do, I mean, the potential is there. 10% is arbitrary, it's any number. The potential is there, if we could calculate what 2% would, you know, is that a substantial enough difference? And we won't know until somebody takes us to court and sees what the court says. So it is probably, if we chose to go that direction, the risk we would be choosing to take with that, but that is a possible solution. Just say, we're giving you the amount you need to do. I believe they've said evidence-based excellent education. And we'll let you raise 1 or 2% more than that on your grant list if you so choose, and see where that goes.
So the other part of the conversation, beyond having the school district boundary set, is knowing what is captured in
Yes.
the base, right? Like, that changes the conversation too. If your base is not high enough and folks are pushed by necessity into that supplemental district spending, that's a different conversation than the only time you enter the supplemental district spending tax is
Right.
for truly extra projects. And I think Senator Beck was talking somewhat before about this, that if the base, was like 99% of your education.
Right. I mean, that's what we need. Now, this is foundation we have is supposed to be based on the present cost
Mhm.
of providing, according to Tammy Colby's numbers, this is what it's costing. We can argue those. Once you figure in the weights and the other, grants, that this is what we are presently spending. Whether or not that's adequate is always subject to debate, but considering we're spending some of the highest amount per pupil in the country, one would assume it should be adequate.
I think an important thing to add on to what you just said is it's what the calculations that Professor Colby has made are the most efficient spending to get to the outcome that we want. So it's based on outcomes and efficient spending, and for current spending. So it's not necessarily it's the most efficient, and that's
Which
important.
means you probably don't have a teacher teaching 3 kids.
Right, so I think that's important to add on to. It's based on hitting sort of the outcomes that we want, the efficiency and the costs currently in the system.
At some point, we're gonna have to reconcile cost and evidence based.
And right, and these things are predicated on what the education policy and governance changes are. So if you get to an evidence-based foundation formula that's predicated right on a bunch of changes happening between now and then in the governance structure and yeah.
And I'm still trying to be able to visualize those changes. We have a time, but we've said a lot of things, and as we work through this process, they're getting more and more based in reality, I hope. And at some point, it's going to go out and we're going to learn reality. But I'd like to try and make this a real, not on our hopes, but on the reality of what's up. Senator Chin.
I don't know how much time we have for this, but I'm looking at your Brigham's guidance slide, and the first bullet point, Vermont students are constitutionally entitled to equal educational opportunities. I think part of this discussion has been recognizing that I don't think that's currently the case in Vermont. I don't think we've achieved equal educational opportunities across every school district in the state. We've seen even evidence from the JFO that Senator Beck pointed to that we have, compared to Alaska, we have the highest disparity in school spending across our districts, the whole country. So I'm worried that as much as we tried something 34 years ago, we haven't necessarily achieved it. So I want to say that before I ask you this question. If we didn't go with the cost basis amount of that was presented by Tammy Colby, but instead it went to a 95 or 90% of that amount. So something that is lower than what the estimated current spending levels are, with the full intention and expectation that districts would have to raise to meet the current spending levels, putting the onus on the voters. So it'd be to the voters to be part of this discussion. I'm all about voter empowerment. Do you think that's any more or less Brigham compliant than just leaving it at 100% based on current spending and allowing them 10% above that?
I think it is less defensible from an equity analysis. It's not to say that a successful challenge would be brought to a system that did that, but what you're saying is we reject the figure that is stated to be a sufficient amount for educating children in Vermont. I mean, and you could say, you'd have to look and see the picture of what happens, right? It could be that everyone goes out and does something on district spending to raise that amount. And so everyone ends up, it's an empirical question as to what happens, right? Like what do the school districts do if you switch to a system like that? So if everyone goes out and they're able to raise the funds that allow them to fund their children, and you have something like an equalized rate that we're talking about, perhaps that's fine, like you provided the educational opportunity, but it really is an empirical question. I guess the reason I started where I did about, it makes me hesitate more is just your outright shifting from the empirically supported number for education stuff.
You may find another.
You could find, I'm not saying that, right, you could have other, I'm just saying that if you literally put in, we want to do 95% of the empirically supported number, right, that is
it's 2/3 of the school districts would sue us immediately, and we would lose.
I don't think so. I didn't win.
Okay, but
Say that we're going to.
I don't think there's any lawyers on the committee except the one at the head of the table.
If I could tag on to just follow from that, my understanding is that the current House proposal is setting this cost base with the intention of, as we would, if these new districts came online, they could gradually lower that amount to an evidence-based approach empirically.
yes,
Okay, so that is the intention, is to use that number
yes.
to drive behavior or to align our allocated amounts relative to what we would expect it would cost to provide adequate education.
Exactly. I mean, I think you're getting at why there's a rollout, why there's a transition period at all, like why you don't just start with the evidence based, and the justification for that, right, is that you don't have the structures in place on which the evidence based are predicated. So you're not just jumping directly to it. You're doing this cost factor to recognize where Vermont stands today. If I could throw out one other complexity with the analysis for that supplemental district spending, like if you did a 95% figure and then you have folks going into SDS to get to 100%, the question then also rides on what the school district boundaries are, again, in the same way that the pieces we were talking about before, because some districts may not at that 10% cap, if they were sufficiently small, they may not have the ability to even get to that 100% figure as talked about. But there's the question as to what the 100% figure means. But I do just want to call out, if you have a 10% cap, depending on what the school district configuration is, you could theoretically have school districts that could not, through supplemental district spending, achieve the 100% base. I mean, that's
which is what we've got now. That,
Sort of starting.
yeah, that we have poor districts that the people just can't pay another penny, and other districts where they can pay 5 cents addition and it doesn't hit their capacity to feed their kids. So that's the new inequity that we've been dealing with since Act 46. That not all towns have equal ability to raise it, and yes, we have fairly wide disparity with kids.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Another thing that I've got in the back of my mind in terms of equity, because that's a word that keeps coming up, is if we have supplemental spending, depending on the size of the districts, that supplemental spending may not be equitably distributed within the district. I mean, if you've got massive districts, unless it's contemplated in this bill, which I don't think it is, I mean, there's going to be there will be power dynamics, and we know that the money will not necessarily flow where it needs.
That's a whole different set of lawsuits stuff.
I'm not saying it's not. All I'm saying is something we need to think about. It's when you do the supplement that you start getting into that
It is
area.
that, yes, if there is no supplement, then we have one more witness. We have a bill to vote out. And then I have us pegged for committee discussion.
Do we have time for a
I'm gonna take a break. I don't know, Alan, can you give us a 10-minute break? Okay, then we'll take a break now. I was gonna take a break after the full committee discussion. Do we have any more technical legal questions for John?
My questions.
Okay, all right.